Quiet on set.
Welcome to the Open to Hope Show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, and this show is brought to you today by the Open to Hope Foundation and the Compassionate Friends, and I am very fortunate to have my good friend, Alan Peterson, Executive Director of the Compassionate Friends, as my co-host. Hi, Alan.
Hi, it's great to be
and
here.
And along with Alan is my co-host on most of our shows, my daughter, Heidi Horsley, Dr. Heidi Horsley. Hi,
Hi,
Heidi.
Mom. I'm glad you didn't forget about me. And of course, we are so happy to have Alan joining us. He joins us on a lot of our shows. So it's awesome to have you here.
It is.
We've covered a lot of ground over
have.
the years.
And we're gonna do a little different take on the show today, guys.
Yeah.
We're gonna talk about putting grief into perspective.
Oh, I like that.
So we're gonna talk to a person who's it's been a while since your child died, and then we're gonna talk to another woman whose mom died, but also has a whole different take on the thing. She's also worried about the environment and the earth, and has written a wonderful book about that. So let's get started. How do you want to introduce our guests?
I would love to. As you said, Mom, we're going to be talking today about putting death into perspective and grief into perspective. And we are going to be speaking with Dr. Kearns and Deborah Kennedy. Dr. Kearns is a bereaved parent, and she wrote the book Sugar Cookies and a Nightmare. And Deborah Kennedy wrote the book Nature Speaks, Art and Poetry for the Earth, and she is a bereaved daughter. And at the end of the show, we are going to be having V sing Surrender, and her album is called Kaleidoscope.
All right. It sounds like it's going to be a great show,
Yeah.
Alan.
Good music, good topic today.
All right. Well, let's start out with Carol. Hi, Carol.
Hi.
You've written a book. You had a daughter die how many years ago?
My daughter died. It's a number that means nothing to me. In fact, you, Alan, told me before the show it was 41 years ago. But because Kristen was pulled out to sea by a wave at age 7, I never saw her again, so I never even saw her dead.
Oh, my goodness.
For me, she's this little girl frozen in time, and I don't know what 41 even means to me, except that her older brother is turning 50 this year, so I figure she must be close, and they were 18 months apart, but it truly doesn't have any meaning to me, that number. And I think that it's just a number that I can't picture Kristen. I could stretch it a little bit till maybe the latest would be 10 years. You know, how would she be at 10? And other than that, she's not an adult.
You know, it's interesting that you're saying that, Carol, because my brother died at 17. And now that my son is 19, he's actually older than my brother was when he died, I see Scott, my brother, as 17. For me, in my head, he's forever 17. I'm like you. I don't see him progressing. I just see him as he was when I knew him, when he was living.
I think my son did a better job of having her grow up more with him because of, I think, friends. And when he went to college, he could picture her in college.
Yeah.
And I just never could. It just ended at age 7. And I also had a granddaughter that died as a baby, little Emma Kristen. And for her, too, she will be a baby. You know, there's no way I can ever see her beyond that because a baby's a baby, you know, so it'll be the same for her.
I think that goes to the heart of our topic, though, today, of perspective and grief, because people are different. I'm the same way as you, Heidi. My daughter, Ashley, who died at 18, I just see her as that 18-year-old. And even when I see friends who are, now married and of hers and having children, I still can't compute the two. But then I know other people that do, so.
Yeah.
You know, I want to talk to Deborah a little bit because she has a little different story. And one of the things that Heidi and I have talked about before is that we have over 1 million people now, Alan, that visit our Open to Hope site. And one of the most visited things are parents, family members who have lost their parents. Yeah. And these are adults. Yeah. These are not children. Right. So, Deborah, you dedicated your book to your mom, right?
That's right. So, in the dedication page, I say.
Do you want to read that for us? Because I
Yeah.
love your dedication. It's so lovely.
It's called Dedicated. It says, dedicated to my family, large and small. With thanks to my mother for telling me she always wanted me to be a writer.
That
I
is
like that.
so. I love that because that one of the things that it shows is how we bring people into our lives and continue with them on through the lives and putting it into perspective. So let's get back to you in a few minutes because I want to talk about some of your ideas about the environment and the earth also.
Sounds good.
So Carol, you went on, one of the things that I think is really cool about you is you went on to become a psychologist, right?
I did.
You went on to become a psychologist, and then you got into grief in the workplace. And what a contribution you've made over the years of your daughter's death.
You know, I focused on grief in the workplace because it started with Kristen's father. We were divorced at the time. I was a single parent, but he was a doctor, and after Kristen's death, he was with us for 2 or 3 weeks. We're going through this nightmare of everything that happened. We have a funeral without a body. His whole world is upside down, inside out, and he goes back to the hospital, and for 3 days, nobody said anything, nothing. And he would go home at night and say to his wife, Susie, I just can't believe it. My world is destroyed, and nobody's saying anything. And I thought, my God, if a hospital can't deal with it, who does? But finally, a nurse fell apart and said, I'm just so sorry, Dr. Kearns, I don't know what to say. And he's like, oh my God, thank God you said something. So I was very interested, and my dissertation was all on grief in the workplace. And it's called Work as a Refuge. And I was very interested in what corporations did with sudden death, where you're in shock for a month, 2 months. Yet if you're working, you're expected to go back to work, and you're probably feeling it for the first time down the line when your grief time's over for most companies. And I was so interested in the grieving employee and what a corporation did to help them. So all my work life was really working with corporations and working with those in a corporation too. And it was kind of twofold because some would return to work after a loss and no one would say anything. And probably the most traumatic the loss, suicide or murder, the less they knew what to say.
You know, it's interesting that your husband went into a medical setting because I was working in a medical setting when Scott was killed, and I felt very little support. And I worked on a liaison team that covered the whole surgical service. And the psychiatrists and all the people that were there, I remember taking kind of a little album that my husband had made on his 1-year anniversary of his death, and they just couldn't deal with it.
Yeah.
It just blew him out of the water. That was 30 years ago, so I don't know how much things have improved, but there are certain settings that you think things are going to be better in. Deborah, did you get support when your mother died? Because I think that's one of the reasons people are going on the internet and trying to pick up things for adult parents, because I don't think people realize how traumatic it is to have an adult parent die.
Yeah, I think it can be pretty shocking how much it rocks your world. And I think that's one of the great things that you're doing is creating a safe and sensitive space for people to relate to these ideas and get some information, because you can feel so alone. And even, as you say, with family members who are in the psychological fields, there still was an unwillingness to really talk about it. It was like, that's done. And I did seek out some people to talk with that I knew were good friends, and that helped. My mother's death wasn't as traumatic for me because I feel like what needed to be said had been said. I saw it coming for quite a long while. I was involved in helping set up hospice care for her. And I think sometimes the sudden deaths, or where you've kind of not been dealing with the relationship the way you should, those are the ones that for me have been more difficult.
That's what I like about the work, Carol, that you're doing, because it's so important in the workplace, because the perspective of grief from those of us that are grieving is so different than the perspective from those who are trying to help us grieve or who we work with. And I think what's in sudden death, what's so hard for people is some of us early on in our grief can do things that we baffle ourselves, you know, that we can work day after day, but as that shock wears off and as we really wrap our head around it, then we can't do those things, and they're just baffled, like how how could you be working, you know, a month after your child died, but then 3 months later you can't get out of bed? And I think educating employers about that, about the real long-term needs, especially of grievers, is important. And I think, so that's why I admire so much the work you do.
Well, I think also it's interesting because it's a tricky thing. If some people, when they go to work, nobody says anything. But on the other hand, some employees don't want to return to work and have 100 people, 50 people come up and say, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. They're just like, please, let me just go to work. This is one place that I know I can do something. My life hasn't changed here. The rest of my life is blown up. So what I found in my dissertation was that it's not the amount of time off. I mean, we need it initially because you have the, you know, the funeral, the relatives, our friends. I mean, you do need it initially, maybe a week, 3 days a week. But down the line, it was important to let corporations know that with this employee, you have an investment and they need flexible time. If you truly believe in this employee, you can just simply say, I know you're having a difficult time today. Just why don't you take the afternoon off? And also giving them credit for the fact that they are there. Thank you for your contribution here, because you feel like, oh my God, if I can't save my child from death, how do I do anything? Your confidence is destroyed. And I think we really need to, one of the things, let me back it up and say this, if and when someone dies and they're in the workplace, it's not just the fact that they died, but for many people, it brings up their own mortality. And for a lot of these people, they may be closer to the person that died. I mean, they spend more time with them during the day than they did with their own families. So I'd go into the workplace often when an employee died and totally volunteer on the other employees' parts, but we'd do a group and just talk about it. And some of them would find they had unresolved losses they never dealt with. Some would say, oh my God, you know, if they're killed in an accident over the weekend, what do we do with the desk? What do we do? There's no preparation. So you would really work with them from the standpoint of letting them express the feelings they have, finding a way that works for all of them. And often it was doing silent memories of the person. And this also helps for the employee that goes back to work and is grieving. Instead of coming up and saying, how are you? Well, you know, my child died or my husband died. I feel like hell. So instead of that, it's just simply putting a little flower on their desk or a cookie or a poem or something on that. Don't ask them how they are. You know, they don't have an answer.
Or maybe
to that.
giving him your book, because the book has beautiful pictures that you've drawn and beautiful poetry. And, you know, I think that getting grief into perspective, walking in nature and doing the kinds of things you're talking about rather than that direct confrontation, one-to-one, we've got to talk about it now, let's talk it out, using other symbols. And I think we get away, I certainly did, when you recently have a sudden death, you do lose the perspective of the life cycle, you know, all those kinds of things. And I think in your book, you talk about the earth and the cycling and all that kind of thing.
Yes, and my book was in large part a way for me to deal with the feelings that I was having. So as I started doing research in the early 1990s, I just had my son, and the internet was there. There was a lot of new research coming out, and I was learning about endocrine disruption and climate change and very distressing ideas, and I started to get rather depressed, right? And I was grieving for all of the extinctions that are happening. So we're losing birds and frogs and so on. And what was I going to do with those feelings? And that's what I decided to do, was to create the book. So to paraphrase Kafka, art is an axe to break open the frozen river in our hearts.
I like that. I love that.
And, you know, that's what it does for me. And that's what I'm hoping, you know, I'll extend that to other people. And, you know, I feel like, to use a meme from the Enlightenment, they used to say, dare to think, right? And they had a tremendous revolution in their society. We need to have a revolution, too, where we dare to think again and embrace science, but we also need to dare to care. And I feel like a lot of times, just like grief is kind of, you know, in your personal life, people are kind of like, are you over it? That was one of your discussions in one of your videos. People are kind of trying to get you to act normal. You know, I've heard that story before. I don't want to go through the grief story again. People also with environmentalists. Aldo Leopold said, to be an environmentalist is to live alone in a world of hurt. Because so many people, we don't want to feel like we're responsible for this. But if we don't acknowledge it, our planet is in dire straits right now.
Well, it sounds like acknowledging it, and then there's actions people can take. And I like that, because when we're grieving initially, it's a very disempowering place to be. You feel like a victim.
Yes.
You feel like something's been done to you. And for me, one of the ways I've healed is to turn my grief outward into action and service. And I'm wondering, with your book in mind, what can people do out there when they hear, okay, all these things about the environment, I feel overwhelmed by it. What can they do to be part of the solution?
Well, I'm really big on crowdsourcing. So, you know, maybe it's $3 a month you can give to an environmental group. Maybe you can buy one organic t-shirt. But honestly, you know, on the national front right now, President Obama had done so many very positive steps. The Paris Agreement for climate change, the first new regulation of our chemical industry since 1976. Okay, that was so important. But it takes a regulatory agency and an aroused populace for these laws to actually be instituted. So obviously, I think that probably getting involved politically is probably the most important thing we can all do at this point.
Some kind of action, which I think we found, haven't we, Alan, that the people, when they start moving out, and you probably found too, you got your degree, you wrote a book, when you start moving out and helping, I studied the Kabbalah at one time, which is a Jewish tradition, and the thing they said was, be creative, God creates. That was their whole thing, God creates, and you should express your godly nature.
Well, I think, you know, and what you're talking about, which is what related to you, you know, advocacy. But advocacy is a tremendous form that we see people use because their perspective changes, what matters to them. And I don't care whether your child was, you know, run over, hit by a car, and there wasn't a stop sign there. I've watched people to get that law changed, or to get that, you know, research funded, or in your case, you know, to work for something as important to use the environment, can be a very healing. And like you say, Heidi, it gives us that purpose again. And so it's just interesting that people, a friend of mine is a big part of legislation, Barry Kluger, you and I both know him, to try to make the Family Medical Leave Act include the loss of a child. And he's worked on this for 5 years. Whether it ever happens or not, I don't know, but just the healing that has come from him getting into the workplace, telling the same thing, the story that you're telling. In fact, I want to hook the two of you up together, because you'd be a great resource for him.
And being politically active.
And being politically active. So maybe it's that, but advocacy, people's perspective changes. What matters to them, or what mattered to them before, can often change drastically as to what matters to them now. And like, I'm in the grief world. If you'd have told me 10 years ago I'd be in the grief world, I'd be like, But I want to ask a question of Carol, if you don't mind me just jumping in here. Because I know you and I, and Heidi, you as well, have been involved in the Newtown Sandy Hook tragedy. And I know you work more directly with families. We've worked some too. But talk a little bit about the community, and how the community responds when there's grief like that, and how they can be most helpful to the families, and what kind of things they might do in a community setting.
I think in a community, I think it can be twofold. And the good part of something like Sandy Hook is that you don't grieve alone, as you and I did. My child's death was, you know, not connected to any others. It was a horrible thing that just happened, and I felt very isolated in it. The downside of that is you also become sort of the Sandy Hook parents. and your child doesn't have the uniqueness of your grief with your child, and the community can often see them as the Sandy Hook parents. When they all took different avenues after their child's death, they have many different foundations. As a whole, for a community, I think it's a good idea to support them and step back from the grief and let them have their unique way of dealing with it. And the different services the Sandy Hook parents had, and they were very, very different.
Yeah.
Because the children were all so different. And even though they were 6 and 7, they were very different at 6 and 7 as Chrissy was. So I want to piggyback on what you said earlier about pain finding meaning. And I really believe that. I think going forward and carrying pain forward is really hard. It's hard to get out of bed. It's hard to move. It's hard to keep going. But finding meaning with your pain, to be able to do something you maybe couldn't do for your child, as many of the Sandy Hook parents did. One started an equestrian program because her daughter loved horseback riding. And that, you know, a lot of parents can't afford that. So she started an equestrian program for her child. One did a whole thing with lighthouses. And I mean, there were just very creative ways of honoring their children. So the meaning, though, that came for them and being able to let the pain go or give meaning to it and do something in their child's name was just huge.
It's that pain
forward.
with purpose.
Yeah,
pain
and
with
pain and
purpose.
purpose.
When you put pain and purpose together, there can be an energy that comes from that we didn't even know we had. People go, well, you're so amazing. But no, I just put a purpose with my pain together, and that's how your book happened.
That's what I'm thinking.
And we do a lot of good things in this world comes out of pain and purpose.
So Deborah, I want you to say one quick thing. If you could say something out there to all these people that are watching that have had a parent die, that are struggling right now, what would your advice be to them?
Say what needs to be said before they pass.
I like
So I feel like with my mom, more of that happened. With my father, it didn't, and he died more suddenly, and that was a much more harrowing death. So there is a finality to death. You can't go back, and so that's really what I learned was that, and also you do need to find the support, and the kind of information you have on your website is so important. So
now tell people where they get your book. Hold it up so we can see it.
Okay, there we go.
And she's won a big award for us.
I just got a Nautilus Award,
Wow,
very
fabulous.
exciting, and I'm shortlisted for another National Book Award, so I'm hoping to get stickers all over the whole front of it.
It's a beautiful book and a
Thank you.
wonderful book to give
Thank
to
you.
someone who is grieving.
So
also.
my publisher is White Cloud Press, and so the way it's set up, there's a ink illustration in earth tones, a poem, and then a short essay. So, you know, it deals with a lot of our current environmental challenges, but also trying to teach people how connected we are to the natural world and to find pathways to healing our relationship with the natural world. So that's kind of my goal. Yeah.
Thank you.
Right.
And Carol, how about your book? You've got a book.
I have a book. My book is older. It came out in 2010, so probably the easiest way is to get it on Amazon. And you can get it through your favorite bookstore, but you have to wait. You have to order it. It's not on the shelves anymore.
All right. Well, thank you guys for being on the
Sugar
show.
cookies and a nightmare.
There's a reason for it. It's in the book.
It is a very good book.
And if you've got one piece of advice for people, what would it be, both of you?
For bereaved parents. I think as a bereaved parent, you cannot go around the grief. It's so powerful. You have to have the courage to go through it.
Yeah.
But then after that, you also need to allow yourself to embrace the joy. And when we look at our children, they all gave us gifts. Christy at age 7 just gave me the greatest gifts, and it was really embracing life. So I just chose that's what I'm going to do, is embrace life.
All right.
Great.
Well, I think one of my goals these days is to communicate about these issues. And I recently had an art show, and I got to lecture to students about it. I do a PowerPoint, and I show the art, and I read some of the poems. And so communicating about these issues.
Right.
Like I'm saying that a lot of these people are feeling it. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Thanks.
And thanks everybody for watching the show today. And we want to remind you, if you've lost hope, please lean on ours till you find your own. And now we're going to hear our song by V, Surrender.
One more shot to break me down. One more balloon to pop before I hit the ground. Even when I have it all, I don't have you. So much to say, but no one to say it to. So I surrender to you. I surrender to you. I surrender to you. I surrender to you. I gave it my all and now it's done. I think it's safe to say that you've won. 'Cause love turned into fighting, and fighting turned into war. But you know what they say, 'cause when it rains